James stood by the window, his eyes tracking the darkening sky, feeling a sense of dread as the storm began to intensify. The wind howled, whipping through the trees, while ominous clouds churned overhead. The hurricane was nearing. He had been monitoring the weather all day, but now the intensity of it was undeniable. "Is it time?" he muttered to himself, as his gaze turned toward the empty street. People had already started hunkering down, retreating to their homes to wait out the storm. But James had an obligation. He had to check on his elderly neighbor, Marjorie. The old woman, who lived just a few houses down, was known for her stubborn independence. Even now, as the wind rattled the windows and the first heavy raindrops began to fall, she refused any help. James had offered to stay with her during the storm, but she had turned him down, insisting that she could handle it on her own. "I'm fine, James," Marjorie had said earlier over the phone, her voice firm despite its frailty. "I've weathered storms before. Don't worry about me." But James wasn't so sure. Marjorie had lived alone for years, and though she was sharp-minded, her health was deteriorating. The last time the area had been hit by a hurricane, she'd almost collapsed trying to secure her garden. She hadn't been able to get back on her feet for weeks. The wind howled again, louder this time, and James glanced at his phone one last time. The hurricane warning had escalated to a mandatory evacuation. He couldn't let Marjorie stay by herself. He grabbed his jacket and keys, then rushed out into the storm. As he jogged down the street, the rain began to fall in sheets, stinging his face, but he didn't care. He was focused on getting to her house before it got any worse. When he arrived at Marjorie's porch, he knocked firmly on the door, already knowing she wouldn't open it without a fight. But when the door creaked open, he was met with her familiar, somewhat annoyed gaze. "James," she huffed, looking up at him with her silver hair frazzled from the wind. "I told you I don't need help." James didn't argue, though he was certain that staying here alone would be unwise. The storm was getting more violent by the minute. He stepped inside, glancing around at her cluttered living room. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me at least stay here with you. The hurricane's coming in fast, and it's not safe for you to be here alone." Marjorie paused, her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to wrestle with herself before finally sighing and stepping back from the door. "Fine, but just tonight, James," she said, her tone softening. "And don't think for a second that I need babysitting." James smiled and followed her into the house, feeling a slight sense of relief. At least she wouldn't be alone. Meanwhile, in Marjorie's garden, an entirely different drama was unfolding. A small, red-feathered cardinal had just finished helping its chicks into the nest on the tallest branch of a nearby tree. The bird had done everything it could to ensure their safety, preparing them for the coming storm. But as the wind began to pick up, the tree's branches began to sway violently. The cardinal fluttered around the nest, trying to protect the 3 chicks from the gusting winds. But in the chaos of the storm, the tree creaked under the pressure, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. With a sickening crack, a large branch snapped, sending the nest crashing to the ground below. The young cardinal chicks, fragile and unprepared for the onslaught of the storm, were tossed about in the debris. One of them, a tiny bird with bright red feathers and wide, frightened eyes, was knocked unconscious by the fall. James, sitting in Marjorie's living room, couldn't have known the chaos happening outside, but the sounds of the storm were unmistakable. Thunder roared, shaking the house, and the wind howled like a wild animal, pulling at the very foundations of the world. Suddenly, a soft, faint chirp came from outside the window. James, startled, stood up and peered out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, but the chirp repeated, now louder and more desperate. There, at the edge of the garden, a small bird lay motionless in the grass, its wings still twitching in the wind. Before he could process what was happening, Marjorie's voice broke through his thoughts. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes narrowing at him from across the room. "Don't tell me you're going out there." James hesitated. The storm was fierce, and it was dangerous to go outside. But something in that tiny bird's cry gnawed at him. "Stay here," he said, already grabbing his jacket. "I'll be right back." He opened the door and stepped into the rain, the cold and wet air biting at his skin. The bird was no longer making noise, but he saw it clearly now, lying in the grass. Its tiny chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, its red feathers muddied by the earth and rain. James's heart skipped a beat as he knelt down, carefully scooping the small creature into his hands. It was warm, alive, but it wasn't moving much. He could feel the faint pulse beneath its chest. The little bird was still breathing, but it wasn't in good shape. He glanced back at Marjorie's house, but the storm had intensified too much. He had to act quickly. Without thinking twice, he turned back and rushed inside, the bird cradled carefully in his hands. "Marjorie, I need your help," he said urgently, entering the house. "This little guy needs medical attention. Can you help me with it?" Marjorie frowned, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the tiny bird. She stood slowly, her frailty evident in the way she moved. "We'll need to get him warmed up first," she said, her voice softer now. "I'll fetch a towel, and we'll need to keep him safe." Together they placed the bird in a small, soft blanket and kept him by the fire, warming his body. James felt the heavy weight of the storm outside, but inside the house, the warmth from the fire and the quiet concern between him and Marjorie created a strange sense of peace. As they worked together to care for the little bird, neither of them could have known that this was just the beginning of an unlikely friendship between an old woman, a stubborn neighbor, and a tiny cardinal. The storm raged outside as Marjorie and James worked together to care for the little bird, which they had now named Joy. The name felt fitting. Despite the bird's obvious trauma, there was something about its presence that offered a strange, soothing comfort. Marjorie was methodical in her actions, her experience with animals evident as she wrapped the bird gently in a soft towel. She had raised dogs, cared for cats, and even tended to injured wildlife in her younger years. Yet this small cardinal was different. She wasn't sure why it seemed so important, but the urgency in her chest told her that this was more than just a bird needing help. "It's going to be all right," James murmured, watching as Marjorie gently wiped the bird's feathers with a damp cloth. Her hands moved with a practiced precision, even though her years were beginning to weigh her down. The warmth of the fire crackled in the background, and for a brief moment, the sounds of the storm seemed to fade. They worked together in silence, the only sound in the room being the occasional rustling of the towel and the soft chirps from the bird, as if it were trying to say something, anything to show it was alive, that it wasn't ready to give up. "I've never been one for pets," James said after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. "But I've always admired the way you care for these creatures. You have a real connection with them." Marjorie glanced up from the bird, offering him a small, knowing smile. Her eyes were sharp, but they carried the weight of years of life and experience. "I think it's the quiet ones, James. They remind you that there's more to life than what we see every day. These animals, they know how to survive even when it seems impossible." James nodded thoughtfully. He had never quite understood that connection between humans and animals, but in the dim glow of the firelight, watching Marjorie carefully tend to the tiny bird, he was beginning to grasp something important. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about finding purpose, something deeper than just the hustle and chaos of everyday existence. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the small house, there was a quiet peace. James occasionally checked the window, where the wind whipped the rain against the glass, but his focus was on the bird now. By the time the storm finally started to settle, its intensity easing off as the night wore on, Joy had begun to stir. The bird's small chest rose and fell in steady breaths, and its eyes flickered open. "Look at him," Marjorie whispered, barely able to contain her excitement. "He's waking up." The little cardinal blinked a few times, then looked around, disoriented but aware. It let out a soft chirp, its tiny beak opening slightly as if trying to speak, but no words came. Marjorie held the bird gently in her hands, bringing it closer to her face. "Don't worry, little one," she murmured, her voice soft but full of warmth. "You're safe now." James watched in awe as the bird slowly started to regain its strength. The tiny creature, who had been so fragile just hours ago, was now showing signs of life, of resilience. There was something profound about the way the bird fought to live, something that reminded him of Marjorie herself. She had been through so many storms, literal and metaphorical, and yet, like this bird, she never gave up. As the hours passed into the early morning, the hurricane finally began to move away, leaving only the remnants of its fury. The rain had stopped, and the sky outside was dark, but calmer now. The house had stopped shaking, and the power, which had gone out earlier, flickered back to life. James glanced out the window and saw that the wind had died down. The worst of the storm was over. "Do you think he'll make it?" James asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the little bird in Marjorie's hands. Marjorie hesitated, her fingers lightly tracing the bird's feathers as if searching for any sign of weakness. She nodded slowly. "He's strong," she said. "I think he's going to make it, but we have to keep him inside for a little longer. He's not ready to fly just yet." James smiled faintly. "I don't think any of us are ready to fly yet." Marjorie chuckled softly, her gaze still fixed on the bird. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we can't try." The next few days were a blur of small victories. Every morning, James would visit Marjorie, helping her care for Joy as the bird continued to recover. They fed him carefully, offering small pieces of fruit and seeds. The bird's feathers began to look more vibrant, the red color of his plumage returning with each passing day. Marjorie made sure to keep the environment warm and quiet, letting the bird rest and heal. Despite the care they took, James knew it wasn't just the physical healing that mattered. The storm had been a traumatic event, one that would linger in the bird's memory. It wasn't just about the broken wing or the bruised body. It was about the emotional toll of surviving such an ordeal. James had seen that in people too, the way they carried the scars of their past, the way fear could hold you in place, even when everything around you was telling you to move forward. "You know," James said one afternoon as they sat by the fire, "I've never been good with animals, but I think I'm starting to understand them. It's not just about fixing the broken parts. It's about giving them time to heal, to find their strength again." Marjorie smiled at him, her old eyes twinkling with a rare warmth. "You're a quick learner, James. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like, but you're getting it." By the end of the week, Joy had regained most of his strength. He was able to flutter his wings and hop around, though he still wasn't ready to fly. Marjorie was cautiously optimistic, though she knew that the next step, the hardest one, was yet to come. When the time came for the bird to leave the warmth of the house and return to the world outside, it wouldn't be easy. There was still a part of Marjorie that wanted to keep him close, to shelter him forever, just as she had always done with her plants and animals. But she knew that the true test of survival was not in keeping something safe forever, but in allowing it to go where it truly belonged. That moment, though, was still some time away. For now, they both just watched the bird, fascinated by its resilience, its slow return to life. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always hope for recovery, if only we gave ourselves, and others, the time and space to heal. Days turned into weeks, and as Marjorie and James continued to care for Joy, the storm outside seemed a distant memory. But inside the small house, life had settled into a new rhythm. The bird, now more energetic, hopped around the living room, testing its wings as it grew stronger each day. It was a small miracle to witness. The tiny, fragile creature that had fallen from the sky now flitting through the air as if it had always belonged there. But the healing process was far from simple. Every time Joy fluttered across the room, a flicker of worry would cross Marjorie's face. She couldn't help but feel that something was still not quite right. She had lived through enough seasons, tended to enough creatures, to know that recovery wasn't always linear. "This is good, though," James said one morning, watching as Joy cautiously tested his wings again, this time with more confidence. "It seems like he's nearly ready to go back outside." Marjorie nodded, though the unease in her chest hadn't yet dissipated. She had grown attached to the bird in a way she hadn't expected. There was something in its eyes, a trust, perhaps, or a recognition that she had saved it. And now it felt like an extension of her home, her life. She had never imagined herself as one to keep birds indoors for long periods, but the time spent caring for Joy had become something of a routine. It had helped her forget, just for a while, the weight of her age and her solitude. "Maybe," Marjorie said quietly, her gaze following the little bird's movements across the floor. "But something tells me he's not quite ready yet. There's still a fragility to him." James smiled gently. "I think that fragility's part of what makes him special." Her eyes softened, and she turned her gaze to James. "Maybe so, but I don't want him to be fragile forever. Not in the way I've been." There was a quiet understanding between them. Marjorie didn't need to elaborate. James knew what she meant. She had lived a long life, and though she carried herself with a sense of quiet strength, there were moments, many of them lately, when she felt the pull of time, the weight of her years. She wasn't as spry as she used to be. Her joints ached, and the long winters took more out of her than they ever had before. But she had never been one to give in to weakness, not when there was life to be lived. "I know," James replied softly. "But maybe the fragility isn't something to fear. Maybe it's just a part of who we are, all of us." Marjorie didn't respond immediately. She simply watched as Joy began to explore a new corner of the room, hopping cautiously over the floorboards. There was something endearing about the way he moved, a certain uncertainty that was impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, James left for a while, promising to return before the evening. Marjorie stayed behind with Joy, who was now perching on the edge of the armchair, his little eyes scanning the room. She reached out and gently stroked his feathers. "You're almost ready, aren't you?" she murmured, more to herself than to the bird. "I think you'll be fine out there." You just need time. But there was a nagging feeling in her chest, one that wouldn't quite go away. She had always believed in the power of time to heal, for animals and for people. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she sat alone with Joy, she couldn't ignore the nagging worry that perhaps time wasn't enough, that sometimes recovery required more than just patience. Later that week, Marjorie received a letter. It was an unexpected surprise, the envelope plain, but the handwriting unmistakable. It was from her daughter, whom she hadn't heard from in several months. The letter was brief, but it was enough to make her heart swell with a mixture of joy and apprehension. She hadn't seen her daughter Caroline in years. Caroline had left home when she was young, pursuing a career in the city, and they had kept in touch only sporadically. They had never been particularly close. The distance between them had always felt like an invisible barrier. But over the years, Marjorie had often wondered if things might have been different, if they had been able to find some common ground. Caroline had written that she would be visiting in a few weeks' time. It was a short visit, only a few days, but it was a visit nonetheless. Marjorie felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety settle in her chest. The thought of seeing her daughter after all this time was both exciting and frightening. What would they talk about? What had changed between them? She placed the letter down on the table, her mind racing. Her life was comfortable, predictable now. She had created a small, quiet world for herself, a world where she could take care of her garden, care for the birds that passed through, and spend time with the people who mattered, like James. But the thought of Caroline's return stirred something in her that had been dormant for years. As the day wore on, Marjorie's thoughts kept returning to the letter. She wanted to be prepared, to show her daughter that she was strong, that she hadn't changed. But deep down, she wondered if she could be the person Caroline remembered. Could she still be the mother her daughter had once known? The following days were a blur of preparations. Marjorie spent time cleaning the house, tending to the garden, and making sure everything was in order for Caroline's arrival. But there was something else on her mind. Joy. The little bird had been growing stronger every day, and it was becoming clear that the time was approaching when he would need to leave. Marjorie stood in the garden one afternoon, watching as Joy tested his wings once more. He fluttered high, hovering briefly before landing back on the ground. She had never imagined she would become so attached to a bird, but in these weeks of caring for him, she had learned to love him in a quiet, profound way. "You'll be okay," she said softly, watching as Joy began to hop toward the edge of the garden, the wind gently ruffling his feathers. The bird chirped, a soft sound, and for a moment, it felt as though everything in the world had paused. Joy looked back at her, his eyes wide and bright, as if he understood that this moment was a goodbye. "I'll always remember you," Marjorie whispered. "You've been a part of something important." With one final flutter of his wings, Joy took to the air. Marjorie watched him fly higher, his small form disappearing into the sky, and she felt a sense of bittersweet pride in her heart. She had given him this time he needed to heal, and now he was free. The house was quiet in the days that followed. Marjorie found herself missing Joy more than she'd anticipated. After weeks of hearing the flutter of tiny wings and watching the birds' tentative hops around her living room, the silence now felt too heavy. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, every gust of wind outside felt sharper. Joy had left, and for a brief moment, Marjorie wondered if she had made the right decision. Had he truly been ready? But the memory of the way he had flown away, strong and free, stayed with her, a reassuring image that filled her with quiet confidence. The bird was where he belonged, soaring through the open sky. Marjorie sat by the window, the sunlight filtering through the curtains. She absent-mindedly twisted the ring on her finger, the smooth metal cool against her skin. Time had a way of slipping by unnoticed, she realized, and before long, the house felt emptier than ever. It wasn't just the absence of the bird. It was the reminder of how much had changed over the years. She looked out at the garden, where the flowers she had tended to for so long were beginning to bloom. The spring season had arrived, bringing new life with it. It seemed fitting, somehow, that after such a tumultuous storm, there was now a period of peace, of renewal. Marjorie's thoughts drifted to her daughter Caroline. The letter had brought back so many memories, many of them tinged with regret. The distance between them had always felt insurmountable. There were years of missed birthdays, forgotten holidays, and unspoken words. And now, with Caroline set to visit, Marjorie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished, something that needed to be said. "Why did I wait so long?" she muttered softly to herself. She was still lost in thought when the doorbell rang. Marjorie startled, quickly standing up. It was late afternoon, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door cautiously, and there, standing on the threshold, was Caroline. Her daughter looked the same. Older, certainly, but still carrying the same smile that had once filled Marjorie's heart with both pride and confusion. There were no grand words of greeting, no hugs or dramatic reunions. Instead, Caroline simply looked at her mother, as though waiting for her to say something first. "Well, it's been a long time," Marjorie said, her voice wavering slightly. She hadn't realized how much she had missed Caroline until now, standing here just a few feet away. Caroline nodded and stepped inside, glancing around the familiar but aged living room. The years had not been kind to the house, and it showed in the faded wallpaper and the slightly sagging furniture. But it was still home, and for all the changes, it remained the same. "I didn't expect the house to look so, well, like it's been here for ages," Caroline remarked with a smile. It was a small attempt at humor, but Marjorie didn't mind. At least it was something. "I've kept things up," Marjorie said quietly. "You know, the garden and all that. It's still the same place it always was." Caroline nodded. "It's nice. Quiet." They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them. It was clear that neither knew exactly where to begin. The years had created a distance that was hard to overcome, and neither of them seemed quite sure how to bridge that gap. "I've been keeping busy," Caroline said finally, glancing around the room again. "Work, life, you know." Marjorie nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. She had never fully understood her daughter's life in the city. The fast pace, the long hours, the endless demands. Caroline had always been independent, driven in a way that Marjorie had never fully understood. It had been hard to relate to her over the years, and though Marjorie had tried, she had never really found her way into Caroline's world. "I've been busy too," Marjorie replied, her voice quieter now. "But I've kept to myself mostly. The usual. The garden, the birds." Caroline's eyes flickered with interest at the mention of the birds. She had always known her mother had a soft spot for them, but she hadn't realized just how much they had become a part of her life. "I heard you had a little visitor recently," Caroline said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "A bird, wasn't it?" Marjorie felt her heart swell a little at the mention of joy. "Yes," she replied softly. "A cardinal. He was hurt during the storm. I found him and I cared for him until he was strong enough to fly away." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "You saved a bird?" Marjorie's lips twitched in a faint smile. "I guess so." Caroline paused, then stepped closer, her tone changing as she looked at her mother more intently. That's really something. I didn't know you were still doing that sort of thing, taking care of animals." Marjorie nodded, feeling a sense of pride in her chest. It wasn't just about the bird. It was about the act of caring, of giving something the chance to heal. She had spent so many years tending to things, nurturing life, that it had become second nature to her. "I suppose it's my way of feeling connected to something," Marjorie said, her voice softer now, tinged with a sadness she hadn't expected to surface. "After all these years, after everything, it feels like the only thing I can still control." Caroline was quiet for a moment. She seemed to be processing her mother's words, her eyes distant as she considered them. Finally she spoke, her voice gentler now. "You know, Mom, I've always admired how you can do that. You're so strong, even when you don't think you are." Marjorie swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. For a moment it felt like a bridge had begun to form between them. Fragile, but present. The years of silence and distance hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in a long time, Marjorie felt that perhaps they could begin to build something new. "I don't always feel strong," she admitted. "But I've learned that it's okay not to be. We all have our weaknesses." Caroline smiled, her eyes softening. "I think we both know that." The two of them stood there for a long time, not saying much, but simply being in the same room. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. And as Marjorie watched Caroline settle into the old chair by the window, she couldn't help but feel that perhaps, just like Joy, they too could find their way back into the light. There was still hope, after all these years. The evening sun cast long shadows across the room, as Marjorie and Caroline sat together in an unspoken silence. The conversation had shifted to safer topics since Caroline had arrived. Small talk about the weather, her job, Marjorie's garden, and even the birds that occasionally visited the yard. But between them lay a heavy silence, one that neither of them knew how to break. Marjorie studied her daughter as she sat by the window, her posture tense yet somehow comfortable in the old armchair. She still carried the same air of independence that had once made her seem so distant. Her hair, once golden like Marjorie's, had deepened into a soft brown, now touched with the early traces of age. But the eyes remained the same, sharp, observant, and yet distant. As the evening wore on, the soft creak of the house settled around them. Marjorie wanted to ask so many things, wanted to reach out and close the gap that had widened between them, but the words stuck in her throat. The years of silence had created a chasm so deep that it seemed impossible to fill. The effort of crossing it felt overwhelming. Caroline, sensing her mother's unease, shifted in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of a cup that had long since gone cold. "So," Caroline said, breaking the silence, "how's the garden? Still the same as always?" Marjorie smiled faintly, appreciating the effort to engage. "It's still there. Some new flowers this year. I've been trying to grow more perennials, so they come back each year without needing as much attention." Caroline nodded, but Marjorie could tell she wasn't really listening. She could feel the distance between them, even when they spoke about mundane things. And so, she decided to take a step forward. "Caroline," Marjorie began, her voice faltering slightly as she reached for the words. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." Caroline glanced up, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Marjorie hesitated, wondering if she was making a mistake. "We haven't spoken much over the years, and I suppose I've always wondered why. I mean, I know there's been a lot of time between us, but—" Caroline looked down, her fingers now tapping lightly against the rim of her cup. Marjorie could see her daughter's walls coming up, the familiar defensive posture that had existed since Caroline was a teenager. "I didn't think you wanted to talk, Mom," Caroline replied quietly. "I thought, well, you seemed okay without me." The words stung more than Marjorie expected, but she didn't react. She had known this moment would come, the quiet acknowledgement of the truth between them. For years, Caroline had been out of her life, and Marjorie hadn't known how to bridge the gap. She had convinced herself that it was fine, that it wasn't worth trying anymore. But now that Caroline was here, the truth was clear. Marjorie hadn't stopped caring. She had never stopped caring. "I never stopped wanting to talk to you," Marjorie said, her voice low but steady. "I just didn't know how. I thought I might be too much. I thought maybe I wasn't the kind of mother you needed." Caroline finally looked up, her eyes softening. "You're not a bad mother, Mom. I don't think that. I think I just had my own life to live, and I wasn't sure how to fit into yours anymore." The words hung in the air between them, neither of them fully understanding the weight they carried. Marjorie felt a tightness in her chest. There it was, the crux of the issue. A misunderstanding, an unspoken distance that had been allowed to fester for too long. They had both retreated into their own worlds, too proud or too afraid to reach out. "It wasn't that I didn't want you in my life," Marjorie continued, her voice trembling now. "But you always seemed to have everything figured out, Caroline. You were so sure of yourself, and I was just doing the best I could. But I never knew how to be what you needed." Caroline was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable as she processed her mother's words. "I never really thought about it that way," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I guess I just thought you'd always be there, and I didn't have to try so hard. Maybe that was a mistake." Marjorie let out a quiet sigh, her eyes closing for a moment as she allowed the weight of those words to settle. She had been so focused on what she hadn't done, what had been left unsaid. But hearing Caroline's voice, hearing her admit that she too had been uncertain, felt like a balm to a wound she hadn't even realized was still there. "I'm sorry, Mom," Caroline added quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "for not being there when you needed me." The apology was more than Marjorie had expected, more than she had hoped for. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't everything that needed to be said, but it was a start. "I'm sorry too, Caroline," Marjorie whispered, "for not being the mother you needed. I always tried, but sometimes I think I pushed you away." There was a long pause as the two women sat in the quiet of the room, letting the conversation settle between them like a soft weight. Neither of them knew what to say next, but the air between them felt less heavy now, less filled with unspoken resentment. "So," Caroline said after a while, her voice tentative but lighter than before, "do you still take care of the garden?" Marjorie chuckled softly, the sound breaking the tension. "Of course. The garden is still my favorite thing. It's where I find peace. Where I can be with the things that I've helped grow. Caroline smiled faintly, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. Maybe I could help you sometime. I don't know much about plants, but I can at least try. Marjorie looked at her daughter, surprised by the offer. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something, an attempt to bridge the gap, to meet her halfway. I'd like that, Marjorie replied with a warm smile. I think you'd be good at it. And for the first time in a long time, Marjorie felt the stirrings of hope. The distance between them wasn't gone, but it was starting to shrink. There was still a long way to go, still much to say, but for now, they had found a way to begin again. As the days passed after Caroline's arrival, Marjorie began to feel a quiet shift in their relationship. The awkwardness that had once filled the spaces between them now seemed to be dissolving, slowly but surely. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but there were moments, small, fleeting, but real, when the distance between them felt a little less vast. It started with the garden. Caroline, despite her initial hesitations, had begun to take an active interest in the flowers Marjorie had planted over the years. The two of them worked side by side, weeding and planting new seeds, and although Caroline still didn't have much of a green thumb, she was learning. The gentle rhythm of their shared task created a sense of normalcy between them, something that had been missing for years. Do you remember the rose bush I planted for Dad? Marjorie asked one afternoon, wiping her brow as she leaned on the shovel. It was right here, by the fence. Caroline, who had been digging beside her, paused and looked around. She did remember, though it seemed like a lifetime ago. The rose bush had been Marjorie's gift to her late husband, a small token of their enduring love. It had thrived in their backyard for years, a testament to his memory, and though it had faded with time, it still held a special place in Marjorie's heart. I remember, Caroline said softly. I remember how you'd always talk to it. Like it was a person. Marjorie chuckled, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Well, it never hurt to talk to the plants. They were good listeners. Caroline smiled at the comment, the first real smile she had shared with her mother in what felt like years. There was something about this moment, the simplicity of it, that felt profoundly healing. It wasn't about grand gestures or apologetic speeches. It was about something as simple as the act of working together, of sharing the familiar things that once connected them. In the following days, Marjorie and Caroline continued to spend time together, walking around the garden, talking about the past, and even laughing. The conversations were still tentative, and the air was still thick with years of silence, but there was a new sense of understanding between them. They no longer seemed like strangers trying to patch together a broken past. They were simply two people, doing their best to find a way forward. One evening, after a long day of work in the garden, they sat on the porch, the soft glow of the setting sun casting golden light over the yard. The air had cooled, and the garden around them was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. Marjorie felt a sense of peace, a kind of contentment she hadn't known in a long time. I've been thinking, Caroline began, her voice tentative again. I know I haven't been the best at staying in touch, and I know you've been waiting for me to come around, but I guess I was just afraid. Marjorie turned to look at her daughter, feeling a twinge of emotion at her words. Afraid of what? Caroline took a deep breath, her eyes focused on the horizon. Afraid of not knowing who you were anymore. Afraid that we wouldn't have anything in common. That I'd come back and you'd be someone different, and we wouldn't have anything to talk about. Marjorie's heart softened. She had always known, deep down, that Caroline's distance hadn't been about her. It had been about fear, about the uncertainty that came with change. But hearing her daughter's vulnerability now, it felt like a breakthrough. I understand, Marjorie said quietly. I've changed too. I think we both have. Caroline nodded, her gaze shifting to the flowers in the garden. I guess I never really took the time to see that. I was so focused on myself, on my own life, that I didn't realize how much you were still here. How much you were still doing. Marjorie smiled softly. I've always been here, Caroline. Maybe I just needed to find a way to let you in. They sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in their thoughts, but for the first time in years, the silence felt comfortable. It wasn't filled with regret or missed opportunities. It was simply the quiet of two people, coming to terms with the changes they had both gone through and finding a way to build something new. The days passed quickly, and soon it was time for Caroline to return to the city. The short visit had been a start, a tentative first step toward repairing the bond that had been broken. Marjorie knew it wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a beginning that she hadn't expected, but one she was willing to embrace. The morning of Caroline's departure, Marjorie stood in the garden, looking at the rows of flowers she had carefully tended to. The roses were beginning to bloom again, their petals soft and vibrant, just as they had been all those years ago. Caroline had already packed her bags and was waiting by the car. "I'll miss you," Caroline said, her voice quieter than usual. She stood by the gate, her hand resting lightly on the wooden fence. "I'll miss you too," Marjorie replied, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She had known this moment would come, but it still felt bittersweet. "Come back and visit more often." Caroline smiled, her eyes softening. "I will, Mom. I promise." As Caroline drove away, Marjorie stood there for a long moment, watching her daughter disappear down the road. She felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and even hope. There had been no grand reunion, no dramatic turning point. It had simply been a series of small steps, moments of understanding that had brought them closer together. And then, as if to confirm that everything was going to be okay, Marjorie felt the breeze stir the air. She turned to look toward the sky, and for a brief moment, she saw a flash of red in the distance. It was Joy, the Cardinal, the same one she had cared for during the storm. He swooped down from the trees, his wings spreading wide as he circled above her head. Marjorie watched, a smile tugging at her lips, as the bird took to the air again, disappearing into the sky. He was free now, just as she had hoped he would be. Marjorie stood there for a long time, watching the sky, feeling a sense of peace settle in her chest. Things weren't perfect. There was still much to work through with Caroline, much to understand about themselves and each other. But for the first time in a long time, Marjorie felt that, just like the bird, they were on their way to something better.